So what's next? Well, we know that the first two, the key ingredients for a flood are well met. Here throughout the basin, both very near record amounts in fall moisture and base stream flow. Our most recent 2009, 10, and 11 historic spring floods did also have these autumnal floods, but not, at least north of Fargo, not as severe as this year. South of Fargo, similar fashion. Frost depth and winter snowpack and snow water is what we'll go into next. So just in general, the frost depths are running below normal, less deep than last year at this time, still 8 to 30 inches across the basin, but highly variable depending on snowpack and standing crops. The winter snowpack is above normal, except for the far northern Red River Basin, and the snow water in that is high, very near our typical winter season values already, higher than in some places. Again, except the exception being across the far northern part of the basin. There's some frost depth analysis, mainly 12 to 24 inches across that corridor, and the background is actual snowpack, and we'll talk about that more. So there's deep frost in most areas, shallower frost down in west central Minnesota, but also variable throughout the field locations where standing crops are. And that's the snow depth that is being carried through our modeling process. And you can see there the snow depths ranging from 10 to 20 inches across most of the Red River Basin. A little shallower on the south end, south of Fargo, near from Fergus Falls down to Wahpeton, Breckenridge, down into Morris, Minnesota, that area. And then a little less as well over the northern part of the Devil's Lake Basin into northeast, far northeast Minnesota, North Dakota, and far northwest Minnesota. Snow water in there, again, these are just bulk averages across those large areas, but a good 3 to 5 inches across most of this central part of the Red River Basin, a little bit less on the far south and the far north ends. By comparison, January 2011 had an additional 1 to 2 inches of snow water equivalent in the south and in the central parts of the Red River Valley, and a higher runoff potential overall than we currently see in 2020, but that's just to compare where we were in 2011 at this time. By comparison as well, January 1997 had higher runoff potential. 2009 actually had a somewhat lesser snow water content at this time. And there's, of course, just a graph relating to our historic spring flooding in the valley. 1997 setting new floods of record across most of the area, still a few older ones in there. And then 2009, especially impacting the southern part of the basin, 2011 peaking in there, but even 2013 and 17 showing the far northern part of the basin on the Pembina River. And then 2019, so a new flood of record down there on the Mustinka River in Traverse County. So again, different types on the tributaries than on the main stem red, but impacts throughout these many very wet years. So what's coming up? Over the course of the next week, expecting less than 1/10 of an inch over the Red River Basin. So that's good news overall. So this first week, if you will, mild and dry conditions over the area. Snowier in week 2. So those maps that you see there are for the 8 to 14 day period, showing somewhat warmer than normal temperatures across the Dakotas and Minnesota, but with that risk now increasing for above normal precipitation starting again as we get into the early part of February. And then from there, throughout the month of February, then middle into lighter part of February, that further plunge into the deep freeze with below normal temperatures. But precipitation, at least not at this point, indicated to be above normal in the February period overall. So it's a little bit of good news. And then as we get further into March and April, the below normal temperature and above normal precipitation trends are expected to continue. So again, that leaves the prospect for a later thaw open. So back to this, we see a lot of purple on there. So we'll talk to some of those areas now, starting out in the far south end of the basin. Looking on the Wild Rice River coming into Abercrombie, this year we're expecting to see mid to high major flows coming into there. And of course, you can see some bridge closures and a lot of road closures that would occur at those levels. This is a product that we started last year just on the main stem red. And with that, you can see that we now have that available for all of these tributary locations as well. And that address is available on the handout and on this slide. So you can see that category of flooding in that middle zone for the showing up in here where the 50% point is again well below record, but Fargo-Moorhead, again, mid to high major showing in there as well. And going into the next, there we go on this other graphic. You can see we're coming in at that mid zone, 50%. That's actually a higher forecast now than the levels we saw in 2019 by a good foot or higher, still well below the 2011 levels there. This area, and I go into the Cheyenne at Valley City because we have some concerns there. We don't often see Valley City coming in at a major flood risk, largely because of the Bald Hill Dam, but there is just such huge flow potential on the Cheyenne River. If you would notice from the heavy precipitation that occurred last fall, as well as the heavy snow, both of those overlap throughout a large part of that middle and upper Cheyenne Valley and across much of east central North Dakota in general, and certainly across the Grand Forks area as well, and up into portions of northwest Minnesota. So this is one area where, again, a huge amount of flow potential coming in on the Cheyenne River. And with that, you can see that that 50% point is just below what would be standing as a flood of record from 2009. Flows on the Cheyenne River as well as onto the Maple River itself, all are coming in and moving west of Fargo into the Cheyenne diversion and up through there and coming in through Harwood into the Red River. So not directly impacting the Fargo-Moorhead area, but the rural areas in Cass County seeing those impacts. And then continuing up, a lot of flows throughout that central part of the basin itself, coming up into the Red River at Grand Forks, again, looking at a major flood stage here with flood wall closures in town as well. Some questions on the rail bridge at that point, whether that would need to close. Here looking at the graphic, the PFAS graphic as we call it, you can see that that's nearly 2 feet above the flood that came through in 2019 at the 50% level. But you can see that we're also pushing high on getting into the 50-foot range or higher. So something, again, to pay close attention to if we continue into an above normal precipitation year. At the Red River at Oslo, again, that's going to flatline pretty high up there and keep that stage for a long period and likely see very broad outflows. Looking at this graphic, you see that it doesn't quite push up into the flood of record, but it is very close to, again, the levels that we saw in 2019. But with that much larger flow, an even larger and broader spread out in that Oslo area up through Drayton, and probably a longer period at the high water. Going into Grafton for a minute and breaking off the Park River there at Grafton, a new city bypass operational for this winter, and so that will take a lot of flow and remove that from the city proper. We are putting out the outlooks for that, but largely this is reflective of what will be going on outside the city. The risk within the city of Grafton will actually be lower overall than this graph would show, but this graph is reflecting the type of impacts that you would have then historically outside the city of Grafton. Still relatively minor to moderate overall, expecting to see below the much more significant floods of recent years, but higher than 2019. 2019 did not have much risk at all. Moving up through Drayton and into Pembina, very similar type of look and feel, where you're going to have again a major flood stage all the way Grand Forks, Oslo, Drayton into Pembina. Last year in 2019, there was not as much of a contributing factor coming out from those northern tributaries. There's a little more substantial flow coming in on those this year. Again, not as huge as the southern basin, but still showing up in there. So pushing it soundly into the major flood stage. And with that, those risks showing up where 50% line is very close to the levels that we're seeing there in 2009. 2009, which was a much bigger flood in the southern part of the basin, not as big a flood in Grand Forks and points north. Moving over a little bit to Devil's Lake. So Devil's Lake Basin overall has somewhat lesser flows coming into there than you see in other parts, but it's still huge amounts of water moving into there. So we could likely see a 2 to 3 foot rise in that. And you'll see that that starts to push back above 1,450 feet. We are currently at 1,440, 49-ish. And so we had been rising all fall. This is the graphic for this past year. And you can see that we decreased substantially throughout the year, getting down near 1448 in September, but then the heavy rains this fall. We've seen a steady uptick in those numbers throughout the fall and early winter months as the lake is still getting those inflows and expecting those inflows to continue both from the fall precipitation and the snow melt. So with that, just on this large scale graphic showing the history of Devil's Lake, you'll see that we're going to be sitting up there and hanging somewhere above the 1450 line as we get into the spring and summer period. To get to the close here, was spring 2019 a top 10 flood? I think it's a resounding yes on that. The southern end of the basin, Wahpeton Breckenridge, if that Breckenridge diversion had not been in play, that would have been a top 5 flood for Wahpeton Breckenridge, but with that diversion, it ends up in 16th place. So that's a change in numbers as a result overall. Now again, a lot of the tributaries here in the northern part of the basin not showing as high, but certainly on the Red Lake River and now. But we're expecting, again, that the conditions are such we should have a higher level flood. Lots of winter to go. But we are going to have impacts, widespread runoff, road closures, flood walls closed, interstates, likely worse than 2019, possibly in the top 5 flood. And these will be the next outlooks coming out Thursdays now, February 13th, 27th, and 12th. And I've set up for a similar type of telecon on those dates. Slides will be available to attendees. We'll send that to the e-blast list earlier. And so if you got the invite, you should be able to get that. And then we'll post them to our front top news on our webpage, weather.gov/FGF, and we'll post them there as well.